Good afternoon and welcome to episode 65 of Apex Instant Tips, brought to you every Friday at 12:05 Eastern Time. I'm Anton, and I almost forgot that I'm the one that's supposed to say that. I sat there with like a deer in the headlights look when I when I first went live. But thankfully, I have once again managed to line up a guest for this show. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce this week's special guest, Hayden Hudson.
Always a pleasure to be here, Anton. Glad to be
Glad to
back.
have you. Yeah, great to have you this week. And it's a little bit of a broken record, but one of the things that you're really passionate about, Hayden, is about testing and making sure that people have quality code. And I understand that this week you're bringing to us another tip in that space.
That's right. So a small departure from the narrow focus of Apex. I want to inspire people to take a look at the unit testing framework called UT-PLSQL.
Well, I guess that's the UT in UT PLSQL, unit testing. I'm very familiar with it, and I think it is, as you mentioned, a little outside of the Apex space, but only ever so slightly in that, people can do a ton of in Apex without doing any PL/SQL, but come on,
Right.
PL/SQL is.
And it's not our goal to rehash what better people than us have already discussed. So our colleague Stephen Forrestine has done a FOIA tips about UT-PLSQL. Connor McDonald in office hours in which Sam Nietzsche came on to present about UT-PLSQL. So there are plenty of very strong resources that I strongly recommend that people check out. And we won't be repeating the same content today.
And it's worth the 20, 30 minutes that it takes to get UT PLSQL up and running. It really doesn't take much to get it up and running.
Right.
I suggest watch today's show. It's going to inspire you to do just that. And if you haven't already, then continue on that journey. How's that?
Love it. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and share my screen and kick off this timer.
Yeah, we only have 5 minutes.
Here we are at the landing page of UT-PLSQL. Just want to make sure people are clear on the spelling if they want to look it up. Okay, so I'm going to kick off this timer. And I thought for today's demo, we could take a look at some code that I've written to capture the CDC's guidelines for how long one should isolate or quarantine based off of 4 Boolean inputs. So whether or not you've tested positive for COVID, whether or not you're able to mask, whether or not you've merely been exposed to COVID, and whether or not your vaccinations are up to date. And they're all Booleans. And so based off of those true or false statements, there is a simple case logic that is only a few lines long to spit out the recommended days that one should either isolate or quarantine according to the CDC. Any thoughts on this code, Anton?
Well, I mean, I think, the code's pretty straightforward. I mean, I see a lot of like little challenges. Like initially, I think there's 16 potential permutations, but then I realized a Boolean can be null. Maybe there's actually 3 to the 4th instead of 2 to the 4th. Like there's actually potential to test a lot here, is my short thing.
Completely. And so the low bar that one can achieve with unit testing is merely to try to prevent your code from regressing. So next time you're working in this code and you make a change, you add some logic, you want to make sure that the previous logic that you already instantiated isn't broken. So that can be achieved through a fairly rote approach to unit testing, which is still very valuable, in which you're merely going through all of the permutations. So that might look like this. So essentially, there are, as you said, upwards of 16 different permutations based off of 4 different binary. I guess it's not quite binary because null is also a possible parameter. But so upwards of 16 different permutations, and I've only captured 7 of them here. But essentially, all I'm doing with this unit testing is I'm going through each. Without really even like engaging with like the meaning of what I'm doing, I just explore all of the different possibilities. So true, false, etc.
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
And so what that looks like from an output standpoint is the following. So it just all you can tell from this is that it works. So next time you make a change and you run this and you get the same output, at least hasn't regressed.
Yeah, and I don't really know what I'm testing, but I know that I'm testing something about Cynic. Yeah, I get it.
And so this will give you some
valuable.
So this is valuable. It tells you that it probably still works the way it intends.
Mhm.
But I think we can do better. I think we can write tests that output something like this. I'll give you a second to read this.
Well, certainly this gives a whole lot more information. It actually tells me what, clearly the person who wrote this test had some understanding of what it is they were testing for.
Right.
Yeah.
When I wrote these tests, I essentially was going through what I considered to be sort of an FAQ of what this test does. So I had a variety of questions that I grouped into sections, and there are more questions that can come up. So essentially, it's an FAQ on the procedure. And
Yeah.
the idea is that if you write your tests like this, when it comes to actually understanding the original procedure, your first stop might not be to try to parse this. Your first stop might actually be to go to the unit testing.
And the unit tests become much more engaging for sure. Yeah.
Right. So the wisdom that I'm applying here is, I definitely want to give credit where credit's due, is I recommend everyone reads Sam Nietzsche's excellent blog post about how to tell a story with your UT PLSQL. And as he mentioned here, it's using the concept of nested context. So this idea of telling a story or documenting your code through unit testing, it would apply to any testing framework. But how one would do this with UT PLSQL specifically is with the virtue of nested context. So what does that look like? So if we take a look at so this is the original one, but that is merely going through the different scenarios.
Right.
I want to compare and contrast this with the one that actually tells a story, and it's more complicated, but this is what it looks like. And
it's really just a bunch of extra comments, right? It's just comments and how you put those comments in. Is that it?
That's right. So there's this context concept, which is key here. So essentially, I'm using what might be referred to as the horror triple, given, when, then, essentially. But and that's the end of my time. But I think I've hit my points.
Yeah, no, I love this tip. It is just our 5 minutes, so I'm going to say all the people that came in for just 5 minutes. That's it right there on the right. Do all those things, like, subscribe, all the rest. Hayden, I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes. I'm going to stay on this just for a moment and talk about the idea that, like, there are actually utilities that work with UT PLSQL to generate that base, sort of less informative code to test out your code. But taking the time to add the comments to give it contextual output really does make this just so much more engaging.
Completely. It's the opportunity to write a higher form of documentation than I'm used to.
Yeah. I think that this is a really interesting tip. And I think that for me, this tip reminds me that, hey, it's not that hard to do a UT PLSQL script, and that I should just get in the habit of, when I write something, tossing a little script into my repository to do this. But also, the other piece is spending the time as a tester to really think about what it's doing is highly valuable.
Completely. And I will further advocate that the person writing the unit test be the person who wrote the original code. It's not a requirement, but certainly that would have the advantage of the person who understands it would write the documentation, which certainly has some intuitive advantages. And two, writing unit testing should change how you code, and you're going to miss out on that learning opportunity if you never write your testing harness.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think everybody that writes code should also be writing unit tests. I sometimes think that teaming up with somebody is also a good way to do it, right? Maybe you work with another person to write the unit test, but and it does take a little bit of time. But anyway, I think that was a great tip. And of course, if anybody has questions, they can put them in the comments. I see a couple of comments have come in, but I'm a little tough for me to look at comments and all the rest. But yes, UTPL SQL, UTPL SQL, UT. Yeah,
it's a bit of a tongue twister.
Yeah, it's funny. I always have a tough time between SQL, SQL. Different people are in different camps on all of these things. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch. Interesting question. Is it possible to do test-driven development using PTL SQL? Hayden, what do you think about this?
Absolutely. In fact, the way I wrote my my UTP SQL is I started with the spec, and I didn't worry about how I would assert these different things. I essentially wrote documentation for what I wanted the procedure to do. So, and that is the definition, as I understand it, of test-driven development. If you're writing your test ahead of actually writing the code, you're driving your development through testing.
There you go. So Hayden, I only came up with a new segment this week, but because it's a new segment, I think it counts for 2. So this week's segment is Will It Compile? And I've got a little bit of PL SQL code, speaking of PL SQL. And so I have a little challenge for you. Today I've written a little package with procedure, and I'll go ahead and show you my screen. And the question is, well, first, I'm going to tell you this does compile. It's pretty straightforward. It's a procedure. We've all seen this. It's got a constant at the top. Actually, maybe that should have been constant, but L, K, whatever it might be, G. This compiles just fine. No problem at all. The question for you, and I'm hoping we might even have Stephen Feuerstein or somebody else that can answer this. What do you think? Will it compile?
So I have actually specifically wondered about this exact scenario, and my instinct is yes. The fact that it's underlined in pink by SQL Developer makes me second guess it, but I'm going to go with it will compile.
Yeah, I guess you have a little bit of a hint there with the red. Here we go. Will it compile? Oh, Stephen, I wonder if Stephen had an answer before I hit will I compile? But the answer is no, it will not compile. Okay. Yeah, you cannot put another global variable after your first procedure.
Which actually is useful to know, because it means that when you are using PL Scope to evaluate your naming conventions, for example, it is possible to test whether or not something is a global constant as opposed to a local constant.
Well, and I appreciate Stephen's willingness to jump in and say I was yeah, when Stephen Feuerstein also gets it wrong, Hayden, I think this is and this is so funny. Consistent with the declaration section of Anonymous Black, I had another will it compile, but I might save my next will it compile for another week, but related to Stephen's comment here. So maybe another week I will pull up another will it compile challenge for you. So
I love this segment.
Oh, he's not wrong. Oh, wait.
No, yeah.
He's
Stephen
not wrong.
Wasn't,
I think Stephen's saying he's not wrong. I think he's saying that the compiler is wrong, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think Stephen did know that this wasn't going to compile.
I don't know. He said me too. I think we're gonna have to watch. Yeah, I think he got it wrong, and then said that he thinks the compiler is wrong. That's my take on this. Well, I don't want to dig too deep into it, but this is my take on it. I'm going to go with it. So he wasn't sure. Anyway, we've got a few comments coming in on it, but all of that said, yeah, it's a funny little thing that I ran across. So.
But it's more, but it's more than just trivia, because like it does have actual use case. It does have, it is actually useful to know this.
And you said the reason for that, and I talked right over you. Go ahead and say it again. Why is this
Absolutely. Yeah.
useful?
So let's say you're trying to assert the naming convention of global constants with PL scope. So if PL scope will tell you if something is a constant, and if it's and it will also easily tell you if it's in a package body. The question is it a global constant? And the only distinction is whether or not it occurs within a procedure or not. And so if you know, so you can tell when your first procedure within your package body starts, and you can tell at what line the constant is declared. And so just by making that comparison, I now know that all of my global constants within my package body are going to occur in that one section of the document. So I will be able to successfully assert whether or not something is a global versus a local package constant.
Right. And PL scope, another great utility for doing these kinds of things. I think PL scope may come back up again before long. I know it briefly came up in our Apex standards tracker. So we'll let people noodle on that for a little bit. And until that comes up, we will at least see folks next week, I hope. They've wasted a perfectly good 16 minutes, it looks like, with us today. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye, everybody. Do all the